Hey everybody, this is Kevin with Nursing KAMP.com. This is Mastering Nursing School and all the 7 things that you need to know about nursing school and what to do to prepare, to study, and to organize your notes. So let's get into the first thing called 4 squares. All right, 4 squares. Now this is the first series in a 7-part series of nursing school where we're going to break down each section of what I do to teach students about how to prepare for nursing school and how to organize your notes. In this videos, we're going to talk more about 4 squares today. Then we're going to go into the burn list, A leaps, A whales, A sleeps, NCLEX questions, and conceptual camp, which is behind us right here. So let's get right into it. 4 squares is just a method that we use when we're in class. And what you do is that you separate your page into 4 distinct squares. And those distinct squares are basically as you're listening to lecture. First off, I'd recommend always record lecture. Because a lot of times what happens is your mind wanders and a lot of times you might get lost and you start to go down this rabbit hole. What the 4 squares allows you to do is just kind of actively listen and then isolate. Isolate is the biggest part of this. And isolation is a way that we take the data that we're hearing and then we pull it out. The first section we're going to look at is called content. And so what you do is you separate your paper into 4 different areas. So when you're sitting there listening to lecture, you basically separate it into these 4 different areas and then you listen. Like I said before, you should always be recording your lecture so that you can go back to this. Now this is to isolate the content as you're going through it. For example, if the teacher starts talking about hypertension, well that's content, so you write down hypertension. And what you'll do next is whenever you write down something, you either put a plus or a minus. And a plus means that you have a good concept of it, you understand what it's about, and you don't really need to study too much about it. So usually if you have a plus in there, it usually means you're okay with it. Now if the teacher starts to talk about something like maybe cardiogenic shock, and you write out cardiogenic shock, and then you write a negative. And because the thing is you might write a negative because as the teacher starts to talk about it, you start to go down this rabbit hole and you start to get lost and you start to glaze over. That's why it's very important to record the lectures and also recognize that this is happening. And so all you want to do is that you want to put a minus mark there. And if you put a negative mark, then all of a sudden, when afterwards, you can go back and look at this. And as you start to go through content, whenever you hear content, if the teacher starts talking about CHF, and they might say right-sided, right? And then you're like, okay, I got a good concept of that, and I'm good with that. So you put a plus there. Now, if you start to get lost, you're like, well, what is he talking about there? You might be talking about pulmonary edema. And then you're like, oh, pulmonary edema. So you write down pulmonary edema, and you're like negative. And then you draw an arrow to that because you related that this was CHF, right-sided, and then they started talking about pulmonary edema. But you started to get a little bit lost about that, so you write a negative. And that's what you want to do is you want to kind of connect your things together as the teacher is talking. Now that's why the recording is going to be important because as you start to move through this content, you're just going to keep on writing down these little things. Now, you don't write a lot of stuff. Like, you don't say, well, the patient has hypertension and this becomes stroke and all these types of things. Now, if you have a positive on there, why do you need to write that? That's what the recorded lecture is for. So you're able to go back and listen and actively listen. Why did I write a plus there? Did I miss that? Did I not miss that? Okay, the next section we're going to look at is called meds. Now, meds are important because now the teacher's talking about it, and the teacher might say, oh, lisinopril. And you're like, oh, I don't know what lisinopril is, and you write a minus mark there. And then that's it. So if the teacher was saying lisinopril and they were connecting it to hypertension, then you draw a line to that hypertension. And what you want to do is as you're doing this 4 squares, and you might have in one lecture, one page, and this might be number 1, and then you go to number 2 and so on. So what you really want to be doing is not sitting there writing out a book, all right? The whole point of that is that's why you record lecture. So when you're recording lecture, you can look at these concepts and it starts to isolate what you know and what you don't know. So as a teacher might be talking about CHF and they might be talking about, oh yeah, Bumex and stuff like that. And you're like, oh, Bumex. Okay, well, that was CHF. Okay, but I don't know much about Bumex, so I put a minus mark there. Okay, and then you continue on with the lecture. And as you're moving through it and this, that, and the other thing. Now, if the teacher starts talking about like a diet, and that's down here, this is called DIPL. This is the other square over there. And then what you say is, okay, well, diet. He said, okay, well, he said low sodium, right? And we said it was in regards to CHF, all right? And then you might say DASH diet, right? And that's related to hypertension. And they might be like, okay, well, I don't know what a DASH diet is, so I'm going to do a minus sign there. And that's it. Just write down plus or minus on it. Now, if you're really, really confused about it, or you're like, oh, this is really interesting, I really want to go down the rabbit hole with that, and you're like, the DASH diet sounds really interesting. It doesn't, but you're like, I really want to learn more about that. You put an asterisk next to it, and then it becomes something else. All right, so once you look at this main sheet, what you want to try to do is, okay, well, what are we talking about on this concepts? When this concept is coming up, you say, okay, well, what was the concept of this lecture today? You know, and that's what you want to kind of reflect on after the lecture's over. And so this area right here is to kind of take this whole thing, and all you do at the end of the class, you say, okay, what was this concept that we talked about that was most important today? You know, we kind of talked about, okay, well, hypertension and CHF, and these are the main concepts right here. Okay, so that's the 4 squares. Now, what do you do with this? Okay, well, that's what you do during lecture. You sit there, you separate your pieces of paper, you separate your sheet by 4 different areas. Then you basically just write bullet points. All right. After the lecture is done, you sit down and you say, okay, well, what were the concepts that he kind of talked about today, or she kind of talked about? Okay, we kind of covered CHF, we kind of covered cardiogenic shock, and these are concepts based on perfusion. Okay, now what do you do? Well, this sheet right here becomes your study sheet. Okay, and that study sheet becomes, okay, well, I take this content. Well, hypertension I'm good with, right? So that's a plus, so I don't really need to study that too much. Well, cardiogenic shock, I'm negative, so I'm going to go study that content. I'm going to go to my book, I'm going to watch some videos on it, I'm going to start to get into it so I can get to a plus, right? And you want to kind of get to the point where, do you know it fully or do you not know it fully? And that's when we start to talk about these areas over here. A sleeps, A leaves, and A whales, which is in the other lectures of this course. Well, I'm going to kind of say, if you know these things, then you know the content. And that's how we decide how thorough and how much we truly know this content. Okay, so what else is this needed for? Well, one of the things is that you want to start to build what's called a burn list, which is the next portion of this lecture, where I'm going to bring this and we're going to talk about the burn list next. And then we're going to break down how well do you truly know this information. All right, I'll see you on the next video. And my name is Kevin, and this is Nursing Camp. And this is a lecture on nursing tutor tips and how to figure out how to look at my content in lecture and how to really study more effectively so I can be successful and pass the NCLEX. We'll see you next time.